Hello, my name is Tommy Rainey. I'm publisher of the Disaster Resource Guide and the new platform Risk and Resilience Hub. Today, we have a special webinar with the opportunity to ask an expert. So I'd like to ask Katie to share and introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Yes, I'm Katie Goen, Marketing Manager at Alert Media, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. And with that, I'd like to officially introduce our speakers, starting with Jeff Hahn. He has more than 30 years of experience in crisis communications, and he is the author of Breaking Bad News, 12 Essential Crisis Communication Tools, which is the book I referenced earlier that you'll hear more about in today's presentation. He is also a public speaker, and he leads specialized workshops on the topic of crisis communications. Additionally, Jeff is the owner and principal of a family of integrated agency brands that concentrate on reputation protection and restoration. So hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Katie. And it's not an emergency, so this is good.
Yes, so far so good. Well, thank you for your time today. And I'd also like to introduce Peter Steinfeld. Peter has been involved in the emergency communications industry for more than 20 years now. He's the Senior Vice President of Safety Solutions at Alert Media. So he works with a wide variety of organizations to help support their initiatives in employee safety, business continuity, and emergency preparedness. And Peter is also the host of the Employee Safety Podcast, our weekly podcast series at Alert Media. And he has had recent conversations with leaders from Salesforce, Amazon, FEMA, Boeing. I could go on and on. So actually, Jeff was one of the podcast guests with Peter just this past December. So if you enjoyed today's conversation, I know you're going to want to check out that episode. But back to you, Peter. Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. And I do encourage you all to go check out the podcast. There's some just fantastic advice in all those conversations.
Absolutely. Well, I do want to just quickly touch on today's agenda before we move forward. So we will be discussing the importance of having an effective crisis communication strategy. We will talk about how to control the narrative during a crisis. We'll go over some common roadblocks and pitfalls that some organizations encounter and how to avoid those. And then finally, we'll get into some case studies and some real world examples of organizations in crisis and lessons learned from them. But before we get to all that, I do want to go ahead and launch our first poll, if we could please, Tommy. So I do encourage you guys to participate in the polls throughout the presentation today. It's just going to help us gain context on our audience, but it's also going to help us guide the conversation as well, which is important. So if you could please take a moment to answer the question on your screen. We're asking, does your organization currently have a crisis communication plan in place? You can tell us yes, no, or we are working on it. So I will give that just a few more seconds, Tommy, and then once you see the results kind of taper off, if you could go ahead and share them with us so that we could go ahead and have a look and see where everyone's coming from. That would be great. Great. Well, good news so far. Great start, everybody. Looks like 64% of our audience are saying yes, but we do have a good portion of folks that are working on it, and then folks as well who haven't quite started on that yet, but probably are looking for some advice on that today. So what do you think about Jeff? Jeff, is that about what you expected response-wise?
Yeah, I think so, Katie. Given the audience here, pretty sophisticated. They have a general sense that this is an important part of the protection of any brand. So good results. I'm encouraged to see them. And let's see if we can't convince the other 7% to come on board, huh?
Sounds good to me. And Peter, is this kind of about what you expected based on your conversations with folks in the industry?
Yeah, definitely. Nothing to add on what Jeff just said. So this is great.
Gotcha. Well, at this time, I'm going to pass things over to Jeff. Tommy, you can go ahead and actually, let me close this poll here. Perfect. Jeff, I'll pass it over to you now so you can discuss your framework for crisis communications. And then just know that Peter and I might chime in as we go through with some audience questions as well as you go along.
Yeah, thanks very much, Katie, and welcome to all of you who have joined this webinar. let me start by extending some appreciation for you just to invest your time in this. My time in crisis communication started with the picture that you're seeing in the webinar. That farm that you're seeing there is where I grew up. And what you might notice about it is that there's a big slab of cement with a grain bin sitting on it. This is Northeast Iowa. And 45 or so years ago, 1975, that big slab of cement used to have a pretty good sized barn on it with 4 silos sitting around it, with 70 head of cattle in it. And in one afternoon, a tornado took all of that away in about 15 minutes. So my journey as a crisis communication person started perhaps when I was 10 years old, and realized that what you think is permanent, you have to adapt and overcome when it suddenly is not. And so it's an interesting personal story for me that is very likely, even subconsciously, what launched me into this career trajectory. And that's it. That's in Northeast Iowa and near a town called Dunkerton. And you can, that's your Google homework. You can look for Dunkerton, Iowa, and you'll know where I grew up and was raised. So my mother still lives on that farm, by the way. She's doing good, 87 years old. Well, what I wanted to talk a little bit about was the opening prompt of controlling the narrative during a crisis. And the challenge that we've got at the top level of this conversation is, why should we even worry about controlling narrative? Well, as you can see by this slide, the conversation and discussion that you probably have in your own organization around this is not when a crisis is going to, or not if a crisis will happen, but when. And the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, if we experience a crisis, when it does happen, how good will we be? And do you think we'll be better? Now, in this particular poll, I had to laugh when I first saw it. The 42% said they're better post-crisis. I would say that they organizationally have more scar tissue, but I'm not sure they're actually better. And the question really is, have we learned lessons? Can we in fact control narrative better as we come out of a difficult situation? The natural human tendency, to be honest, is get the crisis over, let it settle, let's move on and get back to normal. And that is a very big word, normal, in the conversation about crisis. People seek normalcy, and when they don't have it, they are in dissonance. Dissonance, from a psychological perspective, is it's a game changer. It makes you want to do something to reduce that dissonance. And so when we think about moving through a crisis, we've got to ask ourselves, have we done things to reduce dissonance? And so it's an interesting poll to reflect upon. I'm not sure about those 42%. I wouldn't be surprised about the 19 or the 36ers. That feels about right. I guess I've probably gone through, I don't know, between 50 and 100 crises with clients over the years. And I would say we settled out mostly in the 36% to 19% categories. Very rare to actually use a moment like a crisis to significantly improve. And you'll find some exceptions to that for sure. Even in your own organization, you may have experienced that. And we'll find even in crisis communication mythology, like for example, Tylenol, they really improved because of the poisonings that happened back in the 80s. Well, I'm not sure we can say that. If we really peel the onion on that, we can say that packaging really improved. Did their organization improve? Not exactly sure, but we all learn as we go. And we see by this poll that when a crisis does occur, learning can take place. Let's hope that it does.
And this was a PricewaterhouseCoopers poll. Is that right, Jeff?
PricewaterhouseCoopers. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep, that's right.
Sure.
One of the things that have prompted this first phase of the conversation is how to control narrative. And in Breaking Bad News, I spend time in the opening chapters talking about the importance of rapid response team. I don't even get into the ideas of message, messenger, and method of delivery until we cover off the rapid response team. And many of the questions that were submitted prior to the webinar revolve around this particular idea. Your rapid response team and its ability to assemble is critical in the question, how to control narrative. When I think about the question I most often get asked, Jeff, what is the number one thing brands get wrong when responding to crisis? It starts here. If you think about your own readiness as a rapid response team or for your particular organization, can you assemble quickly? Do the people on your rapid response team, number one, even know that they're on your rapid response team? Number two, do they know what room to go to, what phone bridge to call into, what Zoom channel to activate? How are you going to alert them? And that's where Alert Media's expertise is really valuable. Just assembling a rapid response team is the number one thing my clients suffer from and don't get right. And so as we think about the rapid response team, it's the activation that's so critical. Assembling these people together, these characters who play really distinctive roles, is the first most important thing brands can do to create readiness for when that crisis is going to occur. Let's talk a little bit about each of these roles. You'll see in here, and I'm going to skip around just a little bit, you'll see in here a key role down in the lower right-hand corner called Chief Decision Maker. This isn't labeled CEO. It is instead labeled Chief Decision Maker because that is the person who, let's put her at the head of the table as the person who has to synthesize a lot of incoming information and make the decisions that need to be made in a very short amount of time. The second role is Deputy Chief Decision Maker. I put this role as a critical chair at the table because no doubt about it, when crisis hits, it will be the absolute worst time with the people that you need around that table, hiking in the mountains in Alaska, on a plane somewhere above the Pacific Ocean. Chief decision maker is super likely not to be available. So a deputy chief decision maker is also a key part of my rapid response war room table. Following that, I sometimes get asked, well, what's the most important role inside of a rapid response team? And I would have you move your eyes to the upper left-hand corner. I think that the most important role in this team is the rapid response team coordinator. It's typically someone who's very good at administrative organization, who can activate the team, knows how to do that, who can work the chief decision maker and deputy through the activation questions, and then is there effectively to project manage a rapid response team. These people are super organized and they have a stopwatch. They know that you need to move through a set of decisions and they're going to move you along in a reliable time frame. Communications manager and senior communications leader, two distinctive roles at the table. Let me talk a little bit about the difference. Senior communications leader has the responsibility of putting themselves in the shoes of your stakeholders. It's very difficult to think about other people's perspectives in the midst of a crisis, but your senior communications leader has that task. What do each of our stakeholders need to know? What questions might they have? Communications manager, on the other hand, is much more of a frontline person, drafting statements, even managing press if it's an on-site incident, corralling them and getting them organized. And the other two positions or roles around the table, your subject matter experts, These are going to vary per the incident. So pick your particular fund and think about who is your best technical expert. That's the one that gets called in here. And then, of course, legal counsel. There are lots and lots of things to say about legal counsel around a rapid response team table. But I would say that there's a distinction in my mind of why they're so important. They're worrying and thinking about the court of law. Your senior communications leader is thinking about worrying about the court of public opinion. Two very distinctive swim lanes to stay in. And as long as your legal counsel can stay in that lane and not try to take on other people's responsibilities, they'll be exceptional assets to you as you think through and work through your decisions. So that's my array of a rapid response team. You can fill it up with, in the subject matter expert role, any other kind of character that you feel like is important to you. I would say these are the essential roles to play.
Jeff, how do you keep this team prepared when you just don't know if or when you're actually going to need that team? Do they meet daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly? Like, what do you do here?
Once you have your team established and there's a bit of a culture to it, I think that you can just meet annually. If you don't have an actual crisis to manage, schedule an annual tabletop exercise. I teach and facilitate simulators on a regular basis to clients. It's sort of part of your good operational hygiene just to run a good tabletop simulator and get that team back together to work through sort of a hyper condensed time frame to work through their decisions. And in many cases, I have clients that I exercise and drill them using a script so that they are reminded, this is how I need to act in my role. And I've been pleased with the results of that. This is not a kind of natural skill set, I guess I would say. People have to be taught how to work in these roles. So an annual refresher is a really good thing. Boy, if you have a team that wants to do it more often, that is really special. That's a luxury.
Great, thank you.
When I think about rapid response team plans, and it was great to open the webinar with the poll, do you have a plan? I often think to myself, I think the best rapid response plan I ever wrote for a client fit on a business card. And that all it did was say, you are the owner of this very special card. You're a member of the rapid response team. If you get the alert on your cell phone, here's how you assemble. That's the plan. After that, you work with people's training and judgment. And we expect a lot out of our senior leaders in whatever organizations we operate. This is one of those roles that they can play because they exercise good judgment. If, however, you don't like my business card plan, then I would suggest that you include these 5 elements. These are principles that define the way that the rapid response team is going to work together. I'll give you one just as an example. We value speed in our crisis response plan. Speed is the principle. And we value that because of the way the news cycle works, because of our stakeholder expectations, social media, et cetera. And it forces us, because we value that principle, to make decisions quickly. That, however, if you value speed, will also prompt you to practice. So Peter, to your earlier question, if speed is a principle, it'll get you back to the simulator table more often than just once a year, because you want to honor that particular principle. But you can have other principles that allow your team to build its own culture. Activation is the second component. I talked about it in terms of business, the business card. I've never seen more Keystone Cop exercises than I do with activation. Where's this person? Where's that person? Did you call them? Did you activate? Or do they know? How do they? I can't get into the Zoom. It's just massive time sink, and it's exactly at the wrong time. The third part of your crisis communication plan, and I do like doing these incident inventories. You don't have to overcook the grits, to use the expression, when it comes to incident inventory. Just list out ideas in 3 buckets. These are the reputation issues that our brand might experience. These are the safety issues that our brand might experience. These are the emergency issues that we might experience. You can do some ranking on probability and severity. We might talk about that a little bit more, but just do an inventory. And then you can do one more thing. Number 4, you can ask yourself the Dave Matthews Band question. Does anybody remember Dave Matthews Band? Dave Matthews Band had this one song that went like, what would you say? And that's all you have to think about. If you're going to set up your incident inventory, just answer the Dave Matthews Band prompt. What would I say if that happened? What would we think to communicate if that happened? Try not to do too much. Don't try to get too detailed, because I can guarantee you none of your preset messaging is going to be used in an actual crisis. It can provide some guidance, but the work that you'll actually do there in the war room likely won't be very similar to what you preset. It's super good, though, to go through the exercise. And then finally, you might remember, Peter, do you remember a few years ago that I think it was like the mayor of Honolulu, or maybe the governor of Hawaii, who tweeted out there was some huge emergency, like a tidal wave, and it caused this enormous problem. Everybody was panicking in the street. He didn't have the password to his Twitter account, so he couldn't take it back.
Yeah. Was that the inbound nuclear?
Oh, no, that's what it was. It was
Yeah.
Korean nuclear missiles. That's right. I didn't have the password to my Twitter account. I couldn't recall the message. That's just sort of ridiculous, right? So do an inventory of your channels. Who's got the password to our website so we can post information? Who's got the password to our social channels? Compile those assets. That is actually a very good thing to have inside your crisis plan. So I would say those are the 5 compulsory elements if you do want to have a plan on the shelf. My encouragement to you is, if it's more than a couple 3 pages long, you're overdoing it.
Yeah, sage advice.
I say all of this because every crisis is different, but what is consistent is the amount of time that you have. In Breaking Bad News, I try my best to research best practices. And what I have found is there's no research that tells us a brand should respond in X amount of time. But the best brands, the best organizations I've worked with can do what you see in this model in about 2 hours. And think about the time when an incident occurs to when social media might be picking it up these days. You don't have a lot of time. News media, by the way, follows social. So if social is trending, news media is going to be very, very close by. So I have created this model called reputation dissonance. The roller coaster drop that you see here is your frame of mind. And your frame of mind and your rapid response team's frame of mind is what I'm most interested in as a facilitator. If I'm in your war room with you, I'm going to watch you all go into shrink into fetal positions over the course of a couple of hours, because you're dealing with very difficult, incomplete, super complicated messages and issues and inputs and conflicting information. Here's the way we ride that roller coaster down and get back to normal. We activate properly. Then, number 2, issue a holding statement, 100 words or less. Move that out to your stakeholders quickly. Take a breath. That's going to give you just enough time to then consider the 3 M's. What's our message? Who's the messenger? Also, again, let me put an asterisk here. Don't assume it's your CEO. Your CEO might be a lousy messenger, by the way. So if you need me to help you say that, just let me know.
Jeff's words, not yours.
And then finally, method. Now, in Breaking Bad News, what I talk about is a single principle, which is options are better than answers. You don't know what your message is going to be, nor who your messenger is going to be, nor your method of delivery to your stakeholders. So the models I've created that follow this overarching model help give you those options. In messages, you have 16 options. Messenger, you have 9 options. Method, you have 12 options. Options are so much better than answers, and learning them will prepare you simply to say, okay, time for us to create a message. What are our options? Let's move down through those rather than looking at a blank piece of paper and group writing in the rapid response team war room. That's the beauty of this model. It's designed to almost be a do-it-yourself paint by numbers scheme. And it's what I've learned over 30 plus years of being in war rooms. These are the questions that have to be addressed. Of course, the objective of this model is to do exactly what you see on the right-hand side, get back to normal. That is our number one objective. And restoration of a brand is kind of tricky sometimes, depends on the gravity of the situation. But timing is generally what you see on that bottom axis. You're going to be a great brand and do good things for all kinds of people for months and months and years and years. A bad news break is going to occur, and you've got minutes to move through this set of decisions so that you can get back to normal.
Jeff, an interesting question came in while you were talking. A lot of what you've discussed so far is a top-down approach to responding, but how much should people focus on providing frontline employees with training, preparation, resources? So that's a greater number of people out there so they can be ready in the wake of some kind of incident that occurs.
A really interesting question, and it goes to the culture of your organization. I'll use the TikTok box expectations line just to help frame this. If you have a culture in your organization of communicating with stakeholders and preparing them on a regular basis, you can use that method. You can communicate with stakeholders, or let's just say your own employees, sooner rather than later. If, however, you don't have that culture where you communicate and then ask employees to be a part of the process, you're asking them to do something that they don't know how to do. And in this situation, without any practice or any experience or part of that in their culture, it's sort of like you pulling up to a car wreck and the police officer saying, why don't you get out here and perform CPR on this person who needs it? Like, hey, wait a minute. I was just going to the drive-through to get a hamburger. I don't know. So you're going to find yourself in really difficult and challenging water if there's not a culture of activation.
So is it best to perhaps let people know, hey, if something unusual happens, here is who you should point them to?
Yeah, move them back to the top.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Yep. Thanks for summarizing that for me.
And Jeff, one more just while we're on this slide, and then we can move on. How or can this model work for organizations of any size or any industry?
I found that to be true. When I wrote the book, I focused on a number of food case studies because that's it's a big part of our business. But I use this model with all kinds of different clients, and I found it to be quite effective. Even from a scale standpoint, you still, no matter how big or small of an organization you are, nonprofit, government, for-profit, you still have to answer these questions and move through these steps.
Well, let's move on now, I think, to some internal crisis communications.
Yeah, and internal crisis communications is an emphasis in my mind because of what you see on this slide in terms of guiding principles, especially in that left-hand side. Employees are your biggest brand ambassadors prior to a crisis. Why would that change in a crisis? We want their help. And in fact, using and leveraging your goodwill starts internally. Your folks can be a good first line of defense. And they can be messengers for you, not necessarily, hey, let's send them out and talk to the media, but they can take proactive, sorry, that's not a good word for crisis. They can be ready to help in ways that you might not think of. They can, if you can give employees something to do, they can be really good first line of defense. And they can do things like tell people where to go get information, go learn and get informed yourself, use an opportunity to correct misinformation if you hear it. Allow yourself some time to leverage their goodwill so that they can be constructive in the response to a crisis rather than just bystanders. Go visit a website, share accurate information, avoid speculation. These are all things that your team members can do for you during a crisis. So let's not avoid them. In fact, one of the things that they can do is channel any media inquiries that they might get to the appropriate place. And so they don't need to feel like they need to be responsible or be responsive when news media catches them in a parking lot, ambushes them in a phone call, etc. Just let them help you guide those kinds of inbounds into the right place, make them part of the solution. So I'm a big fan of using our goodwill from our internal team members to help us as we go through here, not to be avoided. We're not going to treat them necessarily much different from a messaging standpoint. We don't want to have conflicting messages in play. We need simple and singular messages, but we can in fact give them some guidance. Once they hear the message, here's what you can do. So that's the guiding principle set behind internal crisis communication.
Jeff, one thing that people often wonder about is in a crisis, you're dealing with really imperfect information. So how do you go about deciding how quickly I should put a response out there or a statement out there versus waiting for the most up-to-date information? How do you balance that?
Right. Well, my advice is tell people that it's imperfect as you go and continue to perfect it as you go. Hey, we're not supernatural, superhuman beings here. We can't have all the information at all times on every perspective. And so be human. It's okay. You can, in your messaging, say, we'll update this as we learn more, and then come back and do so. You know, treat them as they're part of the process, not as I need to get this perfect, and then I need to tell you, you need to accept it, and then we move on. That's not real. That's not authentic or actual. So it's okay. Allow yourself the grace and luxury to come back and visit with them again.
And if you take that path, like someone just said, how long in between updates in communication is best?
Not long. Well, of course, in the TikTok box, I put you in a 120-minute pressure cooker.
Yeah.
I'd say that you, given the situation, can dictate terms. It's nice to say in your messaging, hey, we're going to update you on this information, and we're going to do that at, then pick a time on your watch, your clock. It may be 2 hours, it may be 5 hours, given the terms, but do give them that information, that guidance, and then follow through on it. There's no perfect answer to it. Situation dictates, and sometimes crisis events move through their cycle pretty quickly, and you can do that sooner than later. Sometimes they create very durable, unfortunately, situations that move from crisis into issue response, which is that's a long time frame conversation.
Right. And as you think about implementing this kind of framework in an organization, how do you get buy-in from the executive team to adopt this?
Yeah, I've always found it to be a challenge to, especially if there is a substantial cost to a crisis conversation. An executive thinks this is going to cost me my budget It's really going to distract a lot. Everybody's going to be demanding this and this and this. Try to lower those barriers as your number one job. Hey, this is a review of our rapid response team readiness. That's a lower barrier than I'm going to take you through 27 miles of barbed wire and broken glass about what could go wrong here.
Right.
No, let's just focus on a simple component of it that we can control. And with rapid response team, you can set up a diagnostic. I have one that I use with my clients to assess the readiness of a team. It's 15 questions, you get a score, and you just know. We haven't divulged any information that we don't want to. We haven't discussed probabilities that we don't want to. We're simply assessing our own skills. So that's been one way I've brought senior executives who wanted nothing to do with this kind of thing into a conversation. They do want to know that we have an insurance policy. They do want to know that our rapid response team is ready, but they don't want to have to go and look at page 73 of the insurance policy or the rapid response plan. So lower the barriers, synthesize it high, and think about the front end of the TikTok box rather than all the way through it.
Land and expand.
Absolutely right. Good, a really good phrase.
And Jeff, I advanced this slide a little too early. Sorry about that. But if you just want to go over some key takeaways here, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm glad you advanced this earlier because I want people to read that first one like for 27 minutes. Look, I'll bet there are people on this webinar who have run into a situation where an executive said, why don't you just call X person and fix this? And really, that is a signal of delusion. That's a moment where someone has watched that TV show Scandal one too many times. They think there is such a person as Olivia Pope. Like, well, you should just call Oprah and fix this with her. Like, what? Who has Oprah's phone number? This kind of thinking is really challenging to any rapid response team. Look, you got to work through a crisis, not try to wire around it, get it fixed. It's a situation just like if you spilled milk on your kitchen floor. You don't call Olivia Pope and have her fix it. You go get paper towels, you go through the cleanup. That is the number one idea from a takeaway standpoint I would emphasize. Allow anyone who is under this delusion to just go clean up a mess on the floor and then use that as an object lesson in crisis. Options are better than answers. One of my favorite axioms. That maxim has served me so well because it calms people down. Hey, there are a fixed number of options to choose from. This isn't wild open territory. We don't have to invent. In crisis, when your brain is in dissonance, worst time to try to be super creative. Options are terrific then. These are the things that we can choose from. And typically good judgment will allow for a brand or a rapid response team to make good choices and put together their particular customized solution from the options available. If you've ever tried to think inside of a high pressure situation, it's nearly impossible. And so you want to have those options laid out and you want to know what they are. In Breaking Bad News, I try in my models to create those, but you can invent your own inside those models as well. Those would be a few key takeaways that I would emphasize as far as best practice thinking on crisis. And hopefully they are quite helpful and fit in to the participants today fit into their way of thinking.
Absolutely. Well, Jeff, now that we have a better understanding of your model through the slides, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so we can dive a little deeper into the discussion part of it. So Peter, I know we have quite a few questions from registrants about both, pitfalls, roadblocks, and then maybe some real world situations. So do you want to maybe jump into some of those?
Yeah, we got a ton of questions ahead of time. And I know one of the first ones was, what are some of those common roadblocks, pitfalls, or egg on face situations that you've seen businesses and organizations out there make with their crisis communication strategies? Learn from mistakes.
Yeah, for sure. It's really fun actually to learn from other people's mistakes.
Right.
So, I think about the 5 components of the reputation dissonance model and ask myself, yes, assembly is one of the biggest mistakes teams make. They don't know how to get together. But I also think about components of that model and focus on messaging. Um, when the question turns to messaging, I think, boy, we can learn a lot from past mistakes. And let's just take, for example, remember 2017 United Airlines. In the United Airlines case, a passenger was dragged out of their chair, out of their seat. And this was the statement that the CEO made. And by the way, here's sort of the irony of this. The CEO, Oscar Munoz, was voted by the Public Relations Society like 2 months before as Communicator of the Year. But nobody remembers that. This was the statement, though. This is an upsetting event to us here at United, he said. I apologize for having to reaccommodate these customers. So think about that. And now what you remember from that incident. Here we have a situation where a super tortured message was obviously put through a committee. And words like reaccommodate entered the vocabulary, the lexicon of crisis. Why did that have to happen? Especially in this statement, this is an upsetting event to all of us here at United. What about the dude that just got punched in the face? I mean, one of the worst mistakes that we make is having to torture ourselves in messaging and trying to make that the silver bullet. So silver bulleting, if I say this one thing, everything goes away. That's a fixer mentality. Don't get caught in that trap. What would a reasonable person who is witnessing that situation say? That's a great frame of mind to use rather than trying to engage in group right, especially with attorneys around the table, to obfuscate, to try to not be human. And that would be my response to the question at a more specific level of the model, Peter. So yeah, really good one.
Do you have any other examples, real world examples?
I've been studying the Colonial Pipeline crisis. There was ransomware involved in that.
Yep.
And I'm thinking, hey, that CEO did a really good job in a super tough situation. The messaging that came out of that was all about doing the right thing for the country. I thought to myself, wow, I don't know if he means it, but I'm buying that.
Yeah.
And so I really like what happened there in that situation, even though I thought it was just, who would want to be in that pressure cooker? That's a good one to study and look back on because it was an externality. Colonial Pipeline was a victim. And I think what they did very well was they maintained their victim status. What they might have done better is call in other parties. Like, for example, in the wake of that incident, there was a run on gas at retail gas stations all up and down the East Coast. That's when you involve others, like the governors of those states, like the mayors that can speak to their community. We got plenty of gas. There's more coming. They may have needed to expand their group of messengers. That would be my only advice to them, but I'm liking what that particular case study. In fact, I'm rewriting Breaking Bad News right now, and I'm including this updated set of case studies.
What about organizations that manufacture something like food or a product and there's something wrong with it and they've got to do a recall? Are there good examples in the past of things that people have done well or not well?
There have been some good examples, especially there's been some terrific bad examples, but there have been some really good examples. I guess romaine lettuce as a category is particularly susceptible, but we've seen brands like Dole establish blue ribbon panels as a part of their crisis messaging. And these blue ribbon panels can come together and scientifically examine the cause of the situation. This is a really good redirect.
Hmm.
It takes the issue off of the brand and puts it into the realm of science. I'm fond of that kind of idea because it allows people to say, oh, it's not Del Monte or Dole's fault.
Hmm.
It's the fault of something else outside. That's our natural tendency as humans. We try to place fault really quickly. And so I like that blue ribbon panel idea very much. Maybe you might think of it as a shiny object, but I'm a fan.
Well, this question came in. I think it's pretty interesting. It was not a problem 20 years ago, but it is today. The immediate impulse of most people and employees specifically when a crisis happens is to rush to social media and start making posts and things like that. And technically, there's no way you can stop them from doing that. It's their own personal device and personal
That's
account.
right.
So what can you do as an organization to get ahead of that?
Well, first, I would say don't delude yourself. You can't get ahead of it. There is no such thing as being proactive. In crisis by nature, it is reactive. But my suggestion is this. Rapid response teams can create newsrooms, digital newsrooms, that they can use social media to direct people to. So rather than try to respond to posts on Twitter, just flood those zones with get the latest information at thisincident.com and use your newsroom as the gathering place for the latest. I even use those for one particular client for all broadcast media. We don't give interviews for that particular client. We just direct them to that one web page, and they're going to get B-roll. They're going to get statements. They're going to get all of the assets they need to file their stories and use quotes, but those are all going to be controlled. So use social media to direct eyeballs to your newsroom that you're using as your basically your own branded news station.
To really build up this idea of a branded official source of truth.
Right on. I love that idea. Yeah. And there's no right or wrong way to do it exactly, but just having a place to direct people, give them something to do, and they can move away from your rapid response team while you're continuing to manage the crisis.
Yeah.
Peter, do you mind if I jump in with one question here? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I just think this one, I would love to know the answer to this myself. Jeff, in a crisis, does the individual who takes charge of the situation also assume liability? I think there might be a lot of fear out there associated with this.
Yeah, really good question. Well, let's just imagine it as a corporate spokesperson, corporate representative. No, they are actors on behalf of the brand. They are employees of the brand. So it's the corporate brand, it's the corporation that assumes the liability. The individuals don't. Now, if they are acting in an unofficial capacity, off script, or they've somehow or another gone off the reservation, they might be opening themselves up to some sort of liability. But I would say that's probably more from the corporation that they're all of a sudden in trouble, not externally. No, spokespeople are covered by the policies and coverage of the sponsoring brand.
Thank you.
This is a pretty fundamental question, but basic, but I think it's very fundamental. And that is, how is a crisis communication plan different from a business continuity plan?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Crisis communication plans are by nature very fluid, very dynamic. They are meant to solve a situation that is unexpected. The difference in business continuity is, let's imagine what could happen and create alternatives. Typically, this is associated with supply chain disruption. So business continuity can be planned for. And business might be disrupted for all kinds of non-crises events. And so that is a discipline that typically revolves around supply chain and logistics management versus this is a singular unexpected event. So hopefully those differentiators make sense.
It does, yeah. And when you think about notifying your employees within the company when there's something bad happening, how do you roll that out? Do you focus on people that are actually on site first? Do you then add in the remote teams? Do you just go to everybody at once? Is it the same message to everybody? How do you handle that?
Well, in my experience, I'll talk about that. It's great if you have the time and ability to assemble people on site, talk to them in person, then communicate more broadly to remote places. I mean, you can imagine, again, this is reasonable human response. I worked like 250 feet from this and they didn't even tell me.
Right.
Somebody in California called me and asked me. So you don't want that kind of blowback. If you're able to focus on those people near the incident, near the event, then expand out and do that pretty rapidly. Because person who works 250 feet away from the event, next thing they do is call their friend in California or in Texas or wherever. And so very difficult to contain that information. You want to have a nicely sequenced plan in place to move kind of in concentric circles.
And this one's pretty interesting. How do you cast a positive message to customers and key stakeholders that the reality really is that hope is weeks or months away? How do you maintain that positivity?
Asking for a friend? Well, very interesting. Here again, time is the X factor. My advice is stay in the present. Do you know who did a really good job of this? And your perspective on how the brand handled it is going to really vary. But if you study what British Petroleum, BP, did in the Deepwater Horizon crisis, after they got themselves figured out, they actually did a very good job of avoiding speculation or hypothetical conversation. What's going to happen to these people? What's going to happen to the Gulf in 6 months, et cetera? Staying in the present, said, you know what, that's 6 months from now. Here's what I can tell you about what we're doing today. Here are the few things that we are working through. Here's the situation. It hasn't changed, or it has changed in this way or that way. Staying in the present is the principle that I use most to try to keep from moving out into hypothetical land. Interestingly enough, and it's especially true in news media, they'll come back 6 months later and show the file tape where you gave a statement, and they'll use it against you. So staying in the present is really so hard, super challenging to do. But that's the guiding principle, I would say, when time becomes an X factor.
Yeah, deal with what you know, don't speculate. Okay. How do you deal with someone who's trying to take control of a situation, but they're not really going about it the right way? How do you rein them back?
Well, we hope that our rapid response team has a culture. They know each other and they know their roles. However, if you have to intervene in the moment, I will say from experience, my only good resolution to this kind of situation was to give that person something better to do. The way that I've communicated to those who are working at cross purposes, perhaps, or even just sticking their nose in where it's not needed, is to communicate or convey to them, I need to leverage and shape the energy that you have in a positive way. Here is the highest and best use for you right now. And so can I get you to help with this, or this? If not, you've got a bigger challenge. You'll need more people to create sort of a social peer pressure around that bad actor. But I have found that typically you can channel people's energy. If it's unbridled, that's when it becomes a problem. Shape it in the right direction, a highest and best use. They can actually be assets.
We have time for one more quick question and answer, and then we'll provide everyone with some additional resources as well. So Peter, do you have a great one to end on?
This one is actually nuanced, but I think it's actually really interesting based on everything you've said, which is, are there any instances where reactive communication, so waiting, is better than getting proactive about something and proactively communicating about the crisis?
It's possible, especially as you bucket your issues from reputation to safety to emergency. Safety and emergency, those kinds of issues, those kind of crises really need to be talked about. Reputation issues can have a longer gestation time. We might be aware of a possible incident. I had a university as a client, and they had what they thought was a cheating scandal on their hands. Turned out the grading instrument, the machine they were using to grade papers, was the problem, not the kids. So it was good that we didn't somehow announce 500 children, 500 students indicted in cheating fraud. So sometimes, especially if you don't have urgency and you can actually work issues before you announce them, you can avoid crisis conversation. And remember, crisis is an unexpected and public event. If you are able to work it so before it becomes a public event, you might give yourself some breathing room. And that's a good opportunity for you as a rapid response team to understand this is a reputation style question. Therefore, let's work it, make sure that we understand it. Lives are not at stake. There is no situation that requires moving out into crisis mode.
Okay. Katie, can't we just keep going like after hours with Jeff? I've got like 30 more questions to ask him here.
So guys, if you didn't get your question answered today, we will reach out to you to make sure that you get the information that you need. So no worries there. And I also now do have some additional resources to share. But before I do get to those, I do want to take a second to poll our audience just one last time. And just to let you know, you've got a lot of great information that you've heard today from both Jeff and Peter. And Alert Media also in general can help you build a crisis communication plan that's tailored to your organization, or we can even help you improve one that you have currently. And we'd love to do that. So if you do want to learn more, we'd love to chat with you, so you can let us know. If you're not interested in that at this time, no hard feelings. We'll send you some additional resources that can help you out. So go ahead and get those answers in now, and then Tommy, we can go ahead and close out that poll. So those additional resources that I promised you. First, we have the episode of the Employee Safety Podcast that I mentioned earlier with Jeff and Peter. So you can find that episode and many, many more on communication at alertmedia.com. And we also have an excellent blog post about the role of crisis communications in an emergency. So that can also be found at alertmedia.com. We have a resources page with both blog and podcast. And then I also highly recommend that you visit Jeff's website, and that is breakingbadnews.com. And you can find more information about Jeff, about his book, speaking opportunities, and a lot of great stuff. So again, that's breakingbadnews.com. And if you do want to, just continue the dialogue with Jeff and Peter or connect with them, you are welcome to find them on LinkedIn. And really, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you both. Jeff and Peter, this has been fantastic. We really appreciate your time and insights today.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great. I wish we had another hour.
I know. Next part 2 coming soon.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Katie.
Well, yeah, of course, Tommy. That does conclude our presentation. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you on a future Alert Media webinar. Also, of course, thank you, Tommy. Thanks to Risk and Resilience Hub for hosting us today. And thanks again for your time. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and stay safe out there.